The meridian drift groaned like an old man settling into a chair that had seen better centuries. Eron Hale paused mid-weld, listening to the familiar symphony of failing systems that had become his daily soundtrack. Somewhere in the ship's bowels, a conduit was expressing its displeasure through a series of clicking sounds that probably meant something important was about to stop working. "I hear you," he muttered to the bulkhead. "We'll talk about it later." The bulkhead did not respond, which Eron considered a small victory. The day he started getting answers from the walls was the day he would need to have a serious conversation with himself about the long-term psychological effects of isolation. 14 months. That was how long he had been stranded in the outer veil, a sector of space so far from Earth that the light from his home sun had not even begun the journey to reach these coordinates. The corporate expedition that brought him here had promised adventure, competitive compensation, and a chance to work with cutting-edge xenotechnology. What they had failed to mention was the part where the company would collapse into bankruptcy. The main ship would suffer a catastrophic navigation failure, and Eron would find himself bartering his engineering skills for passage on whatever vessel would have him. The Meridian Drift was not his first choice. It was not even his fifth choice. But Captain Voss had needed someone who could keep her aging salvage vessel functional, and Eron had needed somewhere to sleep that was not an airlock. The arrangement worked, mostly, as long as neither of them thought too hard about the future. He finished the weld and inspected his work with the critical eye of someone who had learned that good enough was rarely good enough when the alternative was explosive decompression. The seal held. The clicking sound from the bowels of the ship continued, but that was a problem for future Eron, who would hopefully have had at least one cup of the terrible synthetic coffee that passed for morning ritual aboard the Drift. The ship's internal communication system crackled to life with the sound of Captain Voss clearing her throat. This was never a good sign. Voss only used the intercom when she had news that she suspected Eron would not want to hear in person, which meant she was either about to volunteer him for something unpleasant or inform him that they were all going to die. Given the odds in the outer veil, both possibilities remained perpetually on the table. "Hale, bridge, now." The intercom clicked off before he could respond, which was Voss's way of establishing that this was not a negotiation. Eron sighed, wiped the solder residue from his hands onto a rag that had long since forgotten what clean meant, and made his way through the narrow corridors toward the front of the ship. The bridge of the Meridian Drift was a semicircular room that had once been impressive and was now merely functional. Screens flickered with data feeds, some of which were probably accurate. Navigation charts covered one wall, marked with the hand-drawn annotations of crews who had come before. Captain Voss stood at the central console, her weathered face illuminated by the blue glow of an incoming transmission that Eron could not read from this angle. "We received a beacon," Voss said without preamble. "Emergency signal from a structure called the Temple of Veiled Stars. Etherian installation, drifting about 6 hours from our current position." Eron knew the Etherians by reputation only. They were one of the elder species of this sector, ancient and enigmatic, keepers of knowledge and traditions that predated human space travel by millennia. They were also famously private, which made an emergency beacon from one of their sacred sites unusual in ways that set off warning bells in the back of his mind. "What kind of emergency requires a salvage vessel?" he asked. "The technical kind." Voss pulled up a secondary screen showing the transmission details. "Their systems are failing, something about power relays and crystalline matrices. They need someone who can work with technology that doesn't follow standard engineering principles. And you think that someone is me. I think you're the only person on this ship who has successfully repaired a Dralith phase converter using nothing but wire and optimism. The Etherians are offering compensation that could keep us flying for another year. More importantly, they're offering information about shipping routes that could get you closer to charted space." The last part caught Eron's attention, as Voss had known it would. Closer to charted space meant closer to the trade lanes, which meant closer to the possibility of finding passage back toward Earth. He had stopped believing he would ever see his home planet again around month 8, but the hope refused to die completely. It lingered like a stubborn ember, waiting for any excuse to flare back to life. "What's the catch?" he asked. "The catch is that it's an Etherian temple, which means you'll be surrounded by relics and rituals and beings who consider humans to be roughly equivalent to particularly clever pets. You'll need to be respectful, careful, and diplomatic." Eron raised an eyebrow. "Have you met me?" "Unfortunately." Voss almost smiled. "That's why I'm sending you instead of going myself. You have a talent for making things work when they shouldn't. Just try not to offend anyone too badly before you finish the job." The shuttle separated from the Meridian Drift with a shudder that Eron chose to interpret as enthusiasm rather than mechanical failure. Through the forward viewport, he could see the temple of veiled stars growing larger against the backdrop of endless night, and the sight stole the breath from his lungs in a way that made him feel like a child seeing the ocean for the first time. The structure defied easy description. It was carved from stone so dark it seemed to drink the surrounding starlight, its spires reaching upward like fingers grasping for something that remained forever out of reach. The architecture followed rules that human minds were not designed to comprehend, angles that seemed wrong until you looked away and then remembered them as beautiful. Lights pulsed within the temple's depths, soft and rhythmic, like the breathing of some vast slumbering creature. "Well," Eron said to the empty shuttle, "this is either going to be the most interesting job I've ever had or the last job I ever have." Neither the shuttle nor the universe offered any commentary on these odds. The docking procedure was automated, guiding his vessel into a bay that seemed designed for ships much larger and more elegant than his battered transport. As the airlock cycled, Eron took a moment to straighten his jacket and attempt to smooth down hair that had long since given up on cooperation. He was not going to fool anyone into thinking he belonged here, but he could at least try not to look like he had been living on a salvage vessel for the better part of 2 years. His Etherian liaison was waiting on the other side of the airlock. She was tall and slender, with the pale blue skin that marked her species and ears that rose to elegant points on either side of her angular face. Her expression suggested that she had been assigned to this duty as some form of punishment and intended to make Eron share in her suffering. "You are the human engineer," she said. It was not a question. "Eron Hale, pleasure to meet you." The liaison did not offer her name. "Follow me, do not touch anything, do not speak unless spoken to, do not deviate from the path I show you." "Friendly place," Eron muttered under his breath. If the liaison heard him, she chose not to respond. The workshop they assigned him was a chamber carved from the same light-drinking stone as the rest of the temple, illuminated by candles that burned with flames of pale violet and seemed to require neither oxygen nor fuel. Eron had stopped questioning the physics of this place approximately 3 hours after his arrival, when he realized that questioning would only lead to headaches and a profound sense of inadequacy. Relics covered every available surface. Some were weapons, their edges still sharp despite centuries of disuse. Others were instruments whose purpose Eron could not begin to guess, their forms suggesting functions that existed outside his frame of reference. All of them hummed with residual energy, a subtle vibration that he felt in his teeth more than heard with his ears. "These are the items requiring restoration," the liaison had said on that first day, gesturing toward the collection with the enthusiasm of someone describing a tax obligation. "You will repair what can be repaired. You will not attempt to operate any item. You will not remove any item from this chamber. Questions will be addressed during designated consultation periods." When are the designated consultation periods? They will be announced. They had not been announced. 3 days had passed, and Eron had seen the liaison exactly twice, both times in passing, both times receiving nothing more than a curt nod that suggested he was performing adequately enough to not warrant immediate expulsion. He had learned to work alone, to puzzle through problems without guidance, to trust his instincts when his knowledge failed him. The instincts were failing more often than he would have liked. Etherian technology did not behave like technology. The circuits, if they could be called circuits, responded to intention as much as manipulation. The materials shifted their properties based on factors Eron could not identify. He had spent an entire afternoon trying to repair a small device that looked like a compass, only to discover that it would not function until he stopped trying to fix it and simply asked it politely to work again. "This is ridiculous," he had announced to the empty workshop. "I have 2 engineering degrees. I rebuilt a fusion manifold during an asteroid storm. I should not be defeated by a fancy paperweight." The fancy paperweight had activated immediately after this declaration, its surface glowing with a soft inner light that pulsed in what Eron chose to interpret as smugness. Despite the frustrations, or perhaps because of them, he found himself falling into a rhythm that was not entirely unpleasant. The work demanded focus, a complete immersion that left no room for the loneliness that had become his constant companion aboard the Meridian Drift. When he was bent over a relic, coaxing ancient mechanisms back to life, he did not think about Earth or about the years stretching ahead of him in this unfamiliar corner of the galaxy. He simply existed, present in the moment, useful. It was during these focused hours that he began to notice the armor. The suit stood on a dais at the center of the workshop, elevated above the other relics as though demanding respect. It was crafted from a metal that shifted color depending on the angle of observation, sometimes appearing silver, sometimes deep blue, sometimes a purple so dark it bordered on black. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every plate and joint fitted with a precision that spoke of centuries of refinement. But it was more than beautiful. There was a presence to it, a weight of attention that Eron felt whenever his gaze lingered too long. He had asked about the armor once, during a rare encounter with an Etherian priest who had come to observe his progress. The priest's reaction had been immediate and unmistakable, a stiffening of posture, a flicker of something in those pale eyes that might have been warning or might have been fear. The sacred armor of the guardian Saeryn. It is not among the items assigned for your attention. I wasn't planning to touch it, just curious about the craftsmanship. Curiosity is an admirable trait in measured quantities. Excessive curiosity has been the downfall of many. The priest had paused, considering. The armor is bound to its wearer. It carries her memories, her experiences, her essence. To touch it without permission would be to touch her soul. That seems like something you should put on a sign. The priest had not laughed. Eron was beginning to suspect that the Etherians did not laugh at anything, which struck him as a profoundly sad way to move through the universe. But the warning stayed with him, even as the days blurred together and his pile of restored relics grew. He gave the armor a wide berth, approaching other items on the dais without ever letting his hands stray toward that central display. He was careful, respectful, everything Captain Voss had told him to be. He was also increasingly fascinated. The armor seemed to watch him. He knew this was impossible, knew that he was projecting human qualities onto an inanimate object, but the feeling persisted. When he worked late into the temple's artificial night, the candles burning low and the silence pressing close, he could swear the armor tracked his movements with something like curiosity. Sometimes he caught himself speaking to it, explaining what he was doing with the other relics, sharing observations about Etherian engineering that had no other audience. "You're going a bit mad, Hale," he told himself one evening, addressing his reflection in the polished surface of a restored shield. "Talking to armor. Next you'll be having conversations with the candles." His reflection offered no argument. On the 7th day, the liaison returned with news that shifted everything. "Your work has been satisfactory," she announced. which Eron suspected was high praise by Etherian standards. The Council has reviewed your restoration of the lesser relics and determined that you possess sufficient skill for more significant tasks. I appreciate the vote of confidence. What tasks did the Council have in mind? The liaison's gaze moved to the central dais, to the armor that stood there like a silent sentinel. The sacred armor has sustained damage that our own artisans cannot repair. The techniques required are beyond our current knowledge, lost during the Great War that these relics commemorate. You will examine the armor and determine if restoration is possible. Eron felt something cold move through his chest. I thought the armor was not among the items assigned for my attention. Circumstances change. The Guardian has been consulted. She has granted conditional permission for examination and, if appropriate, restoration. The liaison's expression remained neutral, but something in her voice suggested that this permission had not been easily obtained. You will treat the armor with absolute reverence. Any sign of disrespect will result in immediate termination of your contract and expulsion from the temple. Termination of my contract, right, not termination of anything else. The liaison did not answer, which was itself an answer. After she left, Eron stood alone in the workshop, staring at the armor that had occupied so much of his peripheral attention over the past week. The candles flickered in a breeze that had no source, casting dancing shadows across metal that seemed almost to breathe. He thought about the priest's warning, about souls and essences, and the weight of touching something sacred. He thought about the 14 months of solitude, the endless repairs, the slow erosion of hope that had defined his existence since the expedition fell apart. He thought about the fact that this armor belonged to someone, a guardian named Saeryn, and that whatever he did in the coming days would touch not just metal but meaning. Well, he said to the empty room, to the watchful armor, to the universe that had brought him to this strange and beautiful place. Let's see what we're working with. The first touch was hesitant, almost reverent, the tips of his fingers brushing against metal that was warmer than it had any right to be. Eron had prepared himself for many possibilities, but warmth had not been among them. The armor felt alive in a way that transcended metaphor, its surface radiating heat like skin that had been sitting in sunlight. Okay, he breathed. That's new. He withdrew his hand, examined his fingers as though expecting to find them changed, then reached out again with more confidence. The warmth remained constant, neither increasing nor retreating, simply present. Beneath his palm he could feel the faintest pulse, a rhythm so slow and subtle that he might have imagined it. He did not imagine it. The workshop had transformed in the hours since he began his examination. Tools lay scattered across nearby surfaces, most of them useless for this particular task, but comforting in their familiarity. The violet candles had been supplemented with additional light sources that he had rigged from salvaged components, creating pools of illumination that revealed details invisible in the temple's perpetual twilight. Eron worked the way he always worked, methodically, thoroughly, treating each new discovery as a thread in a larger tapestry that would eventually reveal its pattern. The damage was subtle but significant. A hairline fracture ran along the left pauldron, nearly invisible to casual observation but catastrophic in implications. Stress marks radiated from the central chest plate, suggesting impacts of tremendous force that the armor had absorbed but not entirely withstood. Most concerning was a section near the collar where the metal had lost its luster entirely, becoming dull and lifeless in a way that felt wrong, like a patch of dead skin on an otherwise healthy body. "What happened to you?" Eron murmured, tracing the edge of the damaged section with careful fingers. "What war leaves marks like this?" The armor did not answer, but he had not expected it to. He had stopped expecting answers from this place days ago. He began with the fracture, applying techniques he had developed through years of working with temperamental alloys and uncooperative materials. The metal responded to his touch with what he could only describe as reluctance, resisting his efforts before gradually yielding to his patient persistence. It was like calming a nervous animal, requiring equal parts skill and empathy. "I know," he said softly, working compound into the hairline crack with movements so gentle they barely qualified as contact. "Nobody likes being poked and prodded by strangers, but I'm trying to help, I promise. Just give me a chance." The armor seemed to listen. The resistance faded by degrees, replaced by something that might have been acceptance or might have been simple exhaustion. Eron chose to believe it was the former. Hours passed in that peculiar temple time that bore no relationship to clocks or planetary rotations. The candles burned without diminishing, their violet flames steady and unwavering. Somewhere in the distance, Eron could hear the faint sound of chanting, voices raised in harmonies that tugged at something deep in his chest. He let the sound wash over him without trying to understand it, allowing it to become part of the rhythm of his work. The polishing began almost without conscious decision. He had finished the structural repairs, sealed the fracture, reinforced the stress marks, done everything that could be done with tools and compounds and engineering knowledge. But the dull patch remained, that lifeless section that seemed to represent something more than physical damage. He reached for a cloth, soft and clean, and began to work the surface with slow circular motions. "You've seen a lot, haven't you?" he said, speaking to fill the silence as much as anything. "I can tell from the marks, little scratches and dents, each one a story. I had a professor once who said that the best machines are the ones with history, the ones that have been used and maintained and cared for. She said you could read a machine's life in its wear patterns, like rings in a tree trunk." The cloth moved across ancient metal, restoring shine to surfaces that had not gleamed in centuries. Eron fell into a meditative state, his thoughts drifting while his hands continued their patient work. He thought about the guardian who wore this armor, tried to imagine what it would be like to carry something so significant into battle. He thought about the weight of tradition, of being part of a lineage that stretched back further than human civilization. He thought about loneliness, about the strange comfort of caring for something that could not care for you in return. "I used to have a motorcycle," he said, the memory surfacing unexpectedly. "Nothing fancy, just an old combustion model that my grandfather had kept running through sheer stubbornness. I spent more time maintaining that thing than riding it. My friends thought I was crazy, pouring hours into something so obsolete. But there was something about it, the ritual of it, the connection." He paused, surprised by how much he was revealing to an inanimate object. But the armor felt like it was listening, and he had not had a listener in so very long. "I miss that, the connection. Everything out here is so alien, so strange. I fix things, sure, but they're not mine. They don't know me. They don't care if I exist or not." He laughed softly, a sound without much humor in it. "And now I'm complaining to a suit of armor about my feelings. Very professional, Hale, really maintaining that engineering dignity." The cloth continued its circuits, and slowly, impossibly, the dull patch began to brighten. Color returned to the metal, that shifting quality of silver and blue and purple that characterized the rest of the armor. Eron watched the transformation with a mixture of satisfaction and wonder, not entirely certain what he had done but grateful that it had worked. He did not notice the change in the air. He did not feel the weight of attention that had joined his own. He was too focused on the armor, on the small miracle of restoration happening beneath his hands, on the unexpected intimacy of this moment in the candle-lit sanctum. The voice came from behind him, low and controlled and heavy with meaning. "You touch what is not yours to touch." Eron's hands froze. The cloth fell from suddenly nerveless fingers, landing on the dais with a soft sound that seemed far too loud in the sudden silence. He turned slowly, knowing what he would find, dreading it and craving it in equal measure. She stood in the doorway of the workshop, framed by the darkness of the corridor beyond. Her skin was the pale blue of Arctic ice touched by moonlight, luminous in the violet candlelight. Her eyes held the cold fire of distant stars, ancient and powerful, and fixed upon him with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. Her ears rose to elegant points on either side of a face that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, and her expression promised consequences that he could not begin to imagine. Saeryn, the guardian, the owner of the armor he had touched, polished, spoken to like an old friend. "I was told restoration was permitted," Eron managed, his voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. "Examination was permitted. Restoration of structural damage was permitted." She stepped into the workshop, and the candles flickered as though acknowledging her presence. "What you have done goes far beyond permission. I polished it, that's all, just cleaning and polishing." "But you touched its essence." Her voice remained controlled, but something moved beneath the surface, something that might have been anger or might have been something far more complex. "You spoke to it. You shared pieces of yourself with something that was not meant to receive them." Eron opened his mouth to respond, to apologize, to explain that he had not known, but the words died before they could form. The vast hall fell silent around them, the chanting ceased, and in the sudden absence of sound, he could hear his own heartbeat pounding against his ribs. "You have crossed a line," Saeryn said, "and now we must determine what that means." The silence stretched between them like the void between stars, vast and cold, and filled with things that neither of them knew how to name. Eron stood motionless beside the armor he had so carefully tended, acutely aware that any movement might shatter whatever fragile equilibrium was keeping him alive. Saeryn remained in the doorway, her eyes never leaving his face, reading him in ways that made him feel transparent. "I did not know," he finally said, "about the essence, about the sharing. I thought it was just metal. But nothing in this temple is just anything." She moved forward, and despite himself, Eron took a step back. "The armor has been bonded to my line for 17 generations. Every guardian who has worn it has left something of themselves within its structure. Memories, emotions, fragments of experience that persist beyond death. When you touched it, when you spoke to it, when you shared your own pain and loneliness with something that was not yours to confide in, you created a connection that our laws take very seriously." "But how seriously?" "Seriously enough that I am within my rights to demand your execution." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Eron felt something cold settle in his stomach, the familiar sensation of having pushed his luck exactly one step too far. He had survived 14 months in the outer veil through a combination of skill and caution. And now, he was going to die because he could not keep his hands off someone else's antique clothing. "That seems excessive," he heard himself say, because apparently his survival instincts had also given up on him. "I was just trying to help." Something flickered across Saren's face, too quick to identify. "You were talking to it about a motorcycle." "You heard that?" "The armor heard it. I heard it through the armor." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its sharp edge. "You told it that you were lonely, that you missed connection, that everything here was strange and alien, and you did not know if anything would ever feel like home again." Eron had no response to that. The words were accurate, embarrassingly so, and hearing them repeated back to him by this intimidating guardian made him want to sink through the floor and keep sinking until he reached whatever passed for a center in this drifting temple. "Do you know how long it has been since anyone spoke to the armor with kindness?" Saeryn asked. "How long since anyone treated it as something deserving of care rather than simply a tool of war?" "I'm guessing a while." 243 years. She moved past him, approaching the dais where the armor stood gleaming with its restored luster. Her hand reached out, fingers brushing the same surfaces Eron had polished, and something in her expression softened. "My predecessors were warriors defined by battle, consumed by duty. They wore the armor because it was required, not because they cherished it. I have tried to be different, but even I had never thought to simply speak to it, to share." "So what happens now?" Eron asked. You mentioned execution, which I would really prefer to avoid if possible, but I'm sensing that's not the only option on the table. Saeryn turned to face him, and for the first time, he saw her as something other than a threat. She was tired, he realized. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion and everything to do with the weight of centuries pressing down on shoulders that had never asked to bear them. She was lonely too, in her own way, surrounded by reverence and ritual, but perhaps lacking the simple human connection that Eron had so accidentally provided to her armor. "The old laws are clear," she said. "Intimate contact with a guardian's sacred armor creates a bond that must be acknowledged. In ancient times, such contact was grounds for either execution or union." "Union meaning what exactly?" "Meaning you would be bound to me as I am bound to the armor. Your fate tied to mine, your life measured against my service. It was how guardians once chose their companions, in ages when such things were left to chance and circumstance rather than council deliberation." Eron considered this information. On one hand, it was an insane proposition, the kind of thing that happened in stories rather than real life. On the other hand, he had been drifting through this sector for over a year without purpose or destination, fixing things that meant nothing for people who would forget him the moment he moved on. The idea of being bound to something, of mattering to someone, held an appeal he had not expected. "What do you want?" he asked. "Not the laws, not the council, not the 17 generations of tradition. What do you want?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She studied him with those eyes like frozen suns, and he had the sense that she was seeing him clearly for the first time, not as an intruder or a problem to be solved, but as a person standing in front of her asking a genuine question. "I want to know why you cared," she said finally. "The armor is a relic of wars you have never fought, bound to a people you do not understand. You could have performed the repairs mechanically, efficiently, without any of the tenderness I witnessed. Why did you treat it with such gentleness?" "Because it deserved gentleness." The answer came without hesitation, surprising them both. "Because everything that has survived that long, carried that many memories, witnessed that much history, deserves to be treated with respect. Because I was tired of being alone, and talking to your armor was the first time in months I felt like I was communicating with something that could hear me." "The armor cannot hear you." "It felt like it could." He shrugged, a gesture that seemed inadequate for the weight of the conversation. Maybe that was enough. Saeryn was quiet for a long moment. Then she walked past him, past the armor, toward a doorway at the far end of the workshop that Eron had never seen her use before. She paused at the threshold, looking back over her shoulder with an expression he could not read. "Come with me," she said. "There is something you should see." He followed her through corridors he had not known existed, past chambers filled with wonders he could barely comprehend, until they emerged onto a balcony of obsidian that jutted out into the void. The view stole his breath for the second time since arriving at the temple. Stars wheeled past in their ancient dance, galaxies spiraling in the distance like pinwheels of light, and the temple itself seemed to float among them, a tiny island of meaning in an ocean of infinity. "I have stood here alone for many years," Saeryn said, her voice softer now, stripped of its formal control. "Watching the stars, contemplating my duty, wondering if there was anyone in the universe who might understand what it means to carry something precious and ancient through the long darkness. And now," she turned to face him, and in the starlight, her blue skin seemed to glow with its own inner luminescence. "Now there is a human engineer who talks to armor about motorcycles and shares his loneliness with sacred relics because he has no one else to share it with. The laws say I must either destroy you or bind you to me. My heart says that perhaps the universe has sent me something I did not know I needed. That's a lot of pressure to put on someone who was just here to fix some power relays." The corner of her mouth twitched, and Eron realized with amazement that he had almost made her smile. "You fixed far more than power relays, Eron Hale. You reminded me that even the most sacred things sometimes just need someone to care for them." She extended her hand toward him, palm up, an offering and a question wrapped into one gesture. The stars continued their eternal rotation around them, indifferent to the small drama playing out on this obsidian balcony, but Eron found that he did not mind their indifference. For the first time in 14 months, something in the universe was paying attention to him, asking him to stay, offering him a place to belong. He took her hand. Her fingers were cool against his skin, but the touch carried warmth beneath it, the same warmth he had felt in the armor, the same pulse of life that had drawn him in from the beginning. "I should warn you," he said, "I'm not very good at being bound to things. I have a habit of breaking what I'm supposed to protect. Then perhaps we will learn together." Her grip tightened slightly, an anchor in the vastness surrounding them. "The universe is large, and my duty carries me to many strange corners of it. I could use an engineer who speaks to armor and refuses to be intimidated by ancient laws." Is that what I was doing? Refusing to be intimidated? You made a joke about execution being excessive. Either you were very brave or very foolish. Mostly just tired of being afraid. He looked out at the stars, at the impossible beauty of this moment, at the future unfolding before him like a map of unexplored territory. Fear gets exhausting after a while. Sometimes you just have to reach out and touch something, consequences be damned. Saeryn followed his gaze, and together they stood on the edge of infinity, two lonely beings who had somehow found each other in the vast darkness between stars. The temple continued its slow orbit, carrying them toward whatever came next, and somewhere in the workshop far below, the sacred armor gleamed with new light, waiting for its guardian to return.